It is high noon, so let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Nicole Netherton, and I'm the Executive Director at Travis Audubon. So glad that you're joining us today to hear Paul Sanchez-Navarro talk about some of our favorite wildlife and habitat here in Central Texas. This talk is called From Canopy to Cave, the importance of the evergreen oak woodlands for endangered species. We're thrilled to have Paul. Just as a reminder, as we get started, it's a best practice for you to turn off your video and your microphone. If you could mute yourself so that we can minimize distractions, we really thank you in advance for that. You're welcome to type any questions as we go in the chat box. And at the end of the presentation, my colleague Kaylee Zazula will lead the Q&A session with Paul. And so let's dive right in. It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Sanchez-Navarro, who's our speaker today. Paul is a fourth-generation Texan who developed a love for nature during family camping trips in our state parks. He holds master's and bachelor's degrees in political science with his master's from the University of New Orleans, focusing on international relations. And he's used that degree in some of his work. He's had a long career in the environmental field, including developing national environmental policy strategies for nonprofits, directing a local organization on the Mexican Caribbean, and teaching a master's level course on sustainable coastal tourism in Mexico. He is a lover of and a great advocate for our beloved endangered species in Central Texas, and we're very happy to welcome here today to talk about those species and how we can protect them. So hello, Paul, and over to you.
Hello, Nicole. Great to be with you all today. Thank you so much for the invitation to do this presentation. I've been back, you mentioned my work in Mexico, which was great, all over the country actually, and then I ended up on the coast. And then for almost 3 years, I was with Defenders of Wildlife here in Central Texas. And recently I'm a private consultant. And I wanted to talk a little bit today for your lunch series with the Travis Audubon Society about the Texas Hill Country, because it's going through some tremendous changes right now. And so I want to talk about those, the species that rely on the Hill Country, and then some of the things going on, and then what we can do. And I put the title From Canopy to Caves because you'll understand in a little while why I got that title. But from the tree, we're going to go from the treetops to the bottoms of the caves in the Hill Country. No, it doesn't want to go. There we go. Okay. And of course, I'm going to start with the golden cheek warbler because we're with Travis Audubon, and so we can talk about the birds first. This is a photo I shot this year, actually doing some monitoring for the city of Austin. We were trying to check if any of the warblers in a particular area were returning, the ones that were banded, because they've banded a bunch of birds. And it was interesting because I've done this for 2 years as a volunteer, and I've not seen a single banded bird. So we had a lot of new population because we counted a decent amount and never saw a banded one. And they're actually kind of hard to find. So it's a lot of work, but it's awesome to be stomping around the forest all morning looking for warblers. But I started with it because it depends on the top of the canopy for a lot of reasons. The canopy of the Ashe, Juniper, oak woodlands of Central Texas. And we put it together because traditionally there's a combination of juniper and oak in Central Texas. It's not just juniper or not just oak naturally. There's usually a combination. And this picture you see is the male warbler up at the top of the tree singing, because the males arrive to Texas in the early spring, about a week before the females start defining territories and singing and defining their territories through song. And then a couple of fights. We did see a fight with a black and white warbler and a golden cheek warbler getting into territory questions. But it's amazing because this little bird weighs about the size of a quarter. So like if you hold a quarter in your hand, that's about the weight of a golden cheek warbler. And when they arrive here in March, they've come from about a 1,500-mile journey from Central America and southern Mexico, where they spend the winter in the pine oak woodlands in the mountainous regions of Mesoamerica. So they actually, I bring that up because it's interesting to note that they depend on an evergreen and oak mix in Central America. And they also depend on an evergreen and oak mix in Central Texas. And they come up here in March and are here until the end of July because they breed up here. The only place they breed is in about 13 counties in Central Texas because of this Ashe juniper. That's the bark of the Ashe juniper of the mature trees is the main element the female uses to build a nest. So all golden cheek warblers, even though we find them in Mexico and Central America in the winter, all of them are born in Texas. So we can say they're true Texans. And that's why I picked it as like the iconic bird to talk about this, the hill country. Because there are a lot of other birds that go through, especially who migrate through here. And I need to make a plug real quick before I forget. We're starting, and Audubon has been a huge actor in this whole initiative for years. The Lights Out Texas is beginning, so we'll talk. I'm sure Nicole or somebody from Audubon will mention that later, and you'll get a lot of emails about that. But the bird migration for the fall migration is starting. Nothing to do with golden cheek warblers. They're already down in Mexico or on their way arriving, but that needs to be talked about later. The fact that this bird only breeds in Texas, and it requires a lot of space to define, like the males define a lot of territory. And so they need a lot of space in order to grow their families. They can't be mixed in. They're not normally found in building nests in urban areas, for example, like you have the blue jays and cardinals and stuff. They've really adapted, but golden cheek warblers are not. They're very wild and they need their space. They're very private. And in the 1990s, they were declared a protected, an endangered species because there were so few of them, and the habitat was changing. So I'm not going to go into the whole history of the protected areas, but there are some rather large protected areas about Conyers Canyonlands right outside of Austin. There's a really interesting combination of right northwest and west of Austin, where we have an excellent example of how federal, state, county, and city authorities, and then private organizations and private landowners can work together to create a mechanism that protects patches that all come together to create almost 60,000 acres of protected area for this bird. And the reason I mention that is because when we think about the golden cheek warbler, it's not only the golden cheek warbler, of course, that lives in that area. There are other species that rely on that as well. So when we're protecting a space for the golden cheek warbler, we're really creating a lot of free and open space for a lot of wildlife species that live in Central Texas. And I want to talk a little bit about how this has influenced growth. For any of you from Austin, you note as you go further on the western side of Austin, there's a lot of green spaces. And I haven't read any studies on this, the economic studies, but I would venture to say that because of the golden cheek warbler being endangered and protected by federal law, the city of Austin and the surrounding counties have had to redefine how they develop, because they had to take into account a certain amount of acres for protecting the golden cheek warbler by law. And if we see in San Antonio, the growth of San Antonio has done the same. There was some excellent warbler habitat around northwest San Antonio, and a lot of that has disappeared over the last 20 years. And what we've seen with some other mechanisms is that the protected areas west of San Antonio have really grown, and there's some conservation easements have been put into place to protect. So they kind of trade off, saying, okay, well, we'll develop on one side right near here next to San Antonio, but we're going to protect so many acres further west of its habitat. Now we just have to make sure the birds understand that. And the question keeps coming around about every 5 years, is there enough habitat for these birds? There's a lot of pressure to delist, what's called delist the golden cheek warbler, to take it off the federal endangered species list. Because when an animal is on the endangered species list, certain land management practices come into play, because you can't destroy key habitat. You can't do anything that would actually kill the species. So you have to make a lot of decisions based on survival of the species. And unfortunately, because of all the growth, there's still a lot of pressure from government agencies, the government land office, developers, to really get it delisted so they don't have to protect it, so they can go in and kind of continue to do the kind of development we've seen over the years. And I have here FWS-SSA, that's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is in charge of making sure that the golden cheek warbler is protected. It's like the link to all the habitat users and the federal government and the law, the Endangered Species Act. And right now they're doing what's called a species status assessment. They're looking at and gathering the latest science about the warbler. Every year, so many people go out. There's so much research being done on the warbler, its habitat, the trees, its migration, to really understand, is it better or worse off compared to what it was years ago? And then all that information is placed into what's called a 5-year review. And then the Fish and Wildlife Service determines whether the species is still threatened and should remain on the endangered species list, or if there's enough habitat and the species has recovered and is no longer threatened, that we can take it off the endangered species list. So it's going through that process right now. So I think it's a good time to be talking about this, because we're experiencing tremendous growth for the city of Austin, and the golden cheek warbler may get run over by that. We're not sure, but a lot of research is going into in Fish and Wildlife. Actually, we have some excellent people working here in the region in Austin, biologists who study and use also the city of Austin, the nonprofit organizations like Travis Audubon, researchers in universities, especially in San Marcos, there was a new study about the habitat near there. So a lot of information is going into it and it's being evaluated right now. I just want to show a couple of pictures because we talk about the top of the trees, but you also have, this is a picture I got a year ago with a warbler kind of checking me out, like why I was taking a picture. And when they're young, they actually do come down to the ground while they're foraging as well. What they mostly eat, and I've just from my personal observation, there's no science behind this, but I've been out there twice. I'd say about at least 10 days out there looking for them and going through the different protected areas. And it's interesting to see because they use the Ashe juniper to build their nest. The long bark, if any of y'all remember the cedar tree, we call the cedar tree, has this really long bark that falls off the tree and is really easy to pull off. That's the main ingredient for the nest. But they don't eat the Ashe juniper. That what the warblers eat is all the insects, worms, different things, which are mostly, I'd have to say, in the oak trees. There are a lot in the evergreen trees and the juniper, but that's the interesting combination of why they needed this oak juniper mix. And we have there's some tremendous oaks out there in these areas and some really old growth. And then of course you have a lot of creeks. You have a lot, I'll talk about in a minute, the karst system of what's down below there. So these are just a few pictures of what's at eye level for humans. And here's the famous Ashe juniper. This is a photo I took in the area where we were monitoring. It's a rather old tree because they only grow about 1 centimeter every 10 years. So if you see a juniper tree that's as thick as you are, it's a very old tree. It takes a really long time to get that big. There are a lot of myths about them. Most people in Texas think that they're invasive or they're non-native. Most people think that they destroy rangeland, that they suck up water, and that they're extremely flammable. And there are a couple of things we need to talk about regarding this. There's an excellent book that just came out recently, Mountain Cedar, Wanted Dead or Alive, by a friend of mine, Elizabeth McGreevy. She did some incredible research about the Ashe juniper and its history throughout Texas and where really what's been going on. Is it from here? And it actually is a native tree. The Ashe juniper, it's called Ashe because it's named after Mr. Ashe. It's not an invasive species. We think we feel that it has that view that it's invasive because when the settlers came in and they started chopping a lot of the flat areas for livestock, the cedar or the juniper is one of the fastest populators. It comes in quickly. So then they saw it as a negative tree because it was so hard to control in any of the rangelands that were then. So it kind of spread out as livestock was being used in the hill country. The cedar kind of spread out as well. The question of whether it sucks up water or not, that's also a myth. It's like most trees. There's studies coming out that show that it's a question of young versus old. Just like most young living things, they need a lot more of whatever they intake. So young trees do take more water than old trees, but the cedar doesn't actually take more water than others. It all depends on where it's growing. So the local dynamic is very important. You have to see where the cedar is growing, especially if it's an area of mixed oak and cedar. There's a very different dynamic than if you have a big field that is now repopulated with young cedars. That field will be using a lot more water when it soaks into the ground because those trees need to grow where they normally wouldn't even be out in the flatlands. The question of it being flammable, it does leave a lot of dead branches at the lower side, but with the proper mix of forest management and natural growth, when you have that oak and evergreen mix, you do have a lot fewer forest fires. Another interesting thing about the juniper is that the shade of the juniper allows the young oaks, the several species of oaks that grow in the hill country, it allows them to get started because they can't really handle the direct sunlight when they're saplings. So the shade of the cedar tree actually does provide growth periods for the oak trees, which then come up, and then that's how you get a balance between the oak and the juniper. I have here carbon capture and soil and forests to track rainfall, not as myths, but as the other side of what we're beginning to learn. there are also studies coming out that show that because they're evergreens, they really do help capture carbon from the atmosphere, fix it in the leaves and in the soil and the root system. And then also, even though we call them evergreens, they actually do lose their tiny leaves every year. We just don't see it because it happens continuously. But there's a certain period of the year that you see a lot of those little bitty leaves on the ground, and those turn into dirt. So the cedar trees actually make a lot of dirt for the whole country as well, whereas the oak makes a lot less dirt. And because it's of the region, there's not a lot of topsoil in the hill country. And then something else that's coming out all over the world, there are more and more studies that show that forests attract rainfall. We used to think that where there's rain, there's forest, but really it's where there's forest, there's rain. And so the relationship, and I was lucky enough to work with some indigenous communities in Chiapas where the golden cheek warbler spends the winter. And then we were working on deforestation issues up in the highlands of Chiapas. And it was interesting because we were coming in with, I'm not a biologist, but I was always organizing. I was like the organizer of the thing and bringing biologists in to talk to the leaders and things. And it was interesting because in the towns, the people would know basically that if you have the trees at the top of the mountain, you'll have rain. So they understood, and on a very different level, the relationship between trees and rainfall. They knew that if you get rid of the trees, you'll lose rainfall. And that's what our science is finally showing us here. If you have more forests, you probably will have more rainfall. So we need to think about that as we develop. So an interesting thing in her book, in Elizabeth's book, was I have to teach people to back off the mountain cedar. She says, stop using it as a scapegoat for the problems that we created. Because if we just scream about what we call cedar, about the juniper, then we stop thinking about how we're managing our water, our soils, our forests, all these other things. We stop thinking about them because we just want to blame one tree, which is human nature, to pick one thing and blame it. And now we're going right below what's going on underneath our feet. Most of y'all probably, if you're from here, you've heard of karst and karst ecosystem. And basically it's dissolved limestone underneath the ground as water flows through the ground, down and across over time, over basically like 1.5 million years, and it washes out a lot of areas, it dissolves areas and creates cave systems. This picture I put just because it's amazing. It's called Cave Without a Name. And it's a good example. Sorry, the clarity is not that great, of all the stalactites and the dynamic. But there's the majority of the caves that have been explored so far are a lot smaller, and there's just a whole lot of different dynamics. What determines what's going on inside the cave is how fast or how slow the water flows through it. So it comes through really slowly, dripping, dripping, dripping over thousands and thousands of years. It creates these tremendous things like these stalactites and stalagmites that you see. If it goes quickly, it depends on what composition of the rock is. But basically, in the Edwards Plateau, we're sitting on what's called a karst ecosystem. And above ground, you have the rivers and creeks, and then the underground, you have the water flow and aquifers. So it's this interesting combination. Everybody talks about it like being a sponge, so we can get a visualization of it if you haven't been down in the caves. But it does create a lot of cave system. I was lucky enough to work in the Yucatan Peninsula. That also is a very similar and also very different system, but it is a tremendous amount, it has a tremendous amount of cave because it's also karst. And then of course, because you have air and water down there, you have a lot of species living down there. I just want to really quick, this presentation isn't to get a huge explanation of the aquifer system, but I had to include it in the slideshow, in one of the slides, because we need to talk a little bit about what we're sitting on top of. If you look up you can see San Antonio and Austin, then basically where the end of that map is on the top right, up here, this is basically I-35 goes right along the edge of the hill country. And we call it the edge because it's basically the escarpment. That's where because the hill country is basically between the high plains of West Texas and the coastal lowlands. This is where Texas takes a step down basically to the coast in what's called the hill. That's why we have the hills. And so we have a lot of small rivers and creeks, a lot of water flowing through here. And we have three main aquifers that are defined: the Edwards aquifer, Edwards Trinity, where they kind of mix, and then the Trinity aquifer. And the Edwards aquifer actually goes out pretty far west and the Trinity pretty far north. And what's interesting about why I wanted to show this is because it shows the relationship. There's a lot of connectivity through central Texas. not just in the hill country. So when we're taking water out of a well in let's say in Johnson City or Blanco, that water's come a long way from different areas. So we need that, and the reason I bring that up is because we have to pay attention to what happens to the water. And then most of us who live in the Austin area, we're used to seeing these signs all over the place in certain parts of West Austin say recharge zone. And those are specific places where we know that water goes more directly into the aquifer. So those are very sensitive places that we need to protect even more importantly. But the whole area does serve as a recharge zone, just much more along that fringe where you see the dark green. That's the majority of the recharge. And I put this picture, it's Bracken Cave, which is south of Austin, North San Antonio. If you haven't visited there, I would recommend a visit. It's amazing. The reason I like this picture is because you look at the top of the photo, you can see the surface of the land, and then it comes down, drops down. There's a collapse area where there's this massive cave underneath there, and over 20 million bats, Mexican free-tailed bats, spend their time in there from March to October. So basically every summer they're up here, and then they spend, again, like many animals, they go down to Mexico for the winter. And it's the largest population of mammals anywhere in the world concentrated in one spot, because it's over 20 million. I've heard up to 32 million, but I don't know which number. So I'll just go with the lower one. Let's just say over 20 million. And it's just an amazing phenomenon. And those bats every night from March to October come out and they eat a tremendous amount of insects in Central Texas. And this is just one cave. It was found accidentally, then it was used for different things. And now the whole area, again, through a wonderful relationship between nonprofit organizations, government, and private landowners, there's about a little over 2,000 acres that are protected right there to make sure that those bats survive and always have a place. But imagine how many caves there are around the hill country that have not been discovered yet, and the animals that are in there. And bats are especially important because, again, depending on the species, they eat insects. They also pollinate as they fly around at night and go from they go to different flowers, they pollinate. And the ones that eat fruit also disperse seeds. And it's interesting because about a third of Texas agriculture is pollinated by bats. So we really need to pay attention to what's going on with the bats. And the bats depend on the caves. So what I'm trying to show here is this link between what's under our feet, what's above our heads. It all is kind of linked together with our own lifestyle. And then if you go further down, you have the salamanders. I know everybody's talked about the salamanders. I apologize again for the blurriness. It looks so nice on my computer screen, but on the big screen, it doesn't look that great. There are at least, how many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 endangered species of salamanders in the Central Texas area, from San Marcos to Pflugerville or Georgetown, north of Austin. The interesting thing about these salamanders, and I put this list: the Texas blind salamander, the Jollyville Plateau, the Georgetown salamander, Salado, Austin blind, and San Marcos, because they live in underground their entire lives, mostly in the water. And so they don't have eyes, and because they don't need them. And it's interesting, if you see they also don't have lungs. If you see those little red things that everybody says are cute, you can't really see it well in this picture, like these little red stringy things coming out of the back of their head. That's actually their gills. That's how they breathe in the water. So they have external gills. There are other salamanders, the ones that live above ground, they breathe through their skin, or some of them do have lungs. There are an amazing amount of species in there. The more and more people are able to get access to them, because the hard part about studying a salamander is how do you actually get to them to see them, because they're living in all the cracks and crevices of the aquifer. But there are places where you can get in the water and see them. And now they're doing DNA studies where they can just take samples of the water, and in the water there are pieces of the salamanders, whether it's their feces or parts of the dead salamander, and they can actually check the DNA and find out what kind of salamander it is. And they're able to say, well, these are related, they're not related. And what they're finding out is in very concentrated areas, like the Jollyville Plateau salamander lives in one tiny part of North Austin, the same as the Georgetown, the Austin blind. They're very isolated species because they don't interact with each other across the hill country. Like a San Marcos salamander is never going to come into contact with a Jollyville Plateau salamander, never in its life. So they don't mix. So we have really specifically developed diversity of salamanders in the whole country. And every year, the researchers are finding out more and more about that. And I'm only mentioning the ones that are in aquifer right now. You do have a lot in the springs area where rivers and creeks, where you have springs coming right out of the ground. That's where salamanders tend to concentrate as well. And then some in the creeks and rivers. There's something interesting that a good friend of mine who researches and has discovered several salamanders, Peter Sprouse, continues to mention that we need to be thinking about the salamander in the cave instead of the canary in the coal mine. For most of us, the canary in coal mine is a really old expression. We're never going to see a canary in a coal mine. We're not even going to know what a coal mine is, but we can understand that. And the reason I mention that is because the salamander in the aquifer depends on very clean water and enough water to survive. So it has to have oxygen in the water to breathe. And when we pollute the water, it reduces the amount of oxygen in the water. So the salamanders, if the water is polluted, the salamanders will go extinct. If the aquifers dry up, the salamanders will go extinct. So when we pay attention to what's going on with the salamander, we can be rest assured that our water quality and quantity is in good shape. So they're very good indicators. And what's amazing is most people don't realize when you're walking around Austin, there are salamanders living underneath you. When you're walking around anywhere in the hill country, there are areas that we don't know about that have a lot of species underneath you. And I think that's one of the main things to take away about the salamander. Whenever you have this water, you just have a tremendous amount of things going on below you. Oh, I missed one of the other species. Where did it go? Oh, well, we'll talk about this now. The humans. This is where we get to the human part. This is a shot of North Austin. I just picked anything to show what development looks like from a satellite photo. So we looked at, okay, golden cheek warblers rely on the canopy and the tree mix. Salamanders require the water quality and quantity, and all the other animals that live in between there depend on healthy ecosystems. And now we have an area from San Antonio to Austin, which is becoming basically one huge metropolitan area with all the growth going on and all the businesses coming here, and especially the recent growth with people coming from California, industry coming from California. Everybody's really happy about Tesla being in Austin, a lot of other companies. I shouldn't call out anybody, but anyway, there are estimates that by 2040, the population will reach 4 million people, right? We're right now right at about 2 million if you count all the surrounding areas. So we're talking about, okay, we're going to double our population in the next 20 years. And thankfully, like these organizations like Audubon and all the other organizations working in the whole country have gotten together and they've created a network called the Texas Hill Country Conservation Network. And they're really looking at this in a strategic way to try to influence how this happens. Because when it just starts growing like mad, you get a lot of deforestation, you get what's called habitat fragmentation. And I mentioned those differently because one is when you just cut everything down, and another is when you chop it into pieces. And so let's say you have a nice big green space, but if it's not enough acres, for example, for the golden cheek warbler male to claim a space, then they won't reproduce in that space. They need a certain amount of space. And we can calculate that. So we can actually make plans. And then the other thing is the question of water quality and quantity. You know, Texas is known for its highs and lows, you know, tremendous flooding and then tremendous drought and flooding, drought, and cycles of this. And the great thing is there's so many studies being done. We have a lot of information at hand. The unfortunate thing about the growth is not only all the development into the suburbs and just spreading out, then you also have another thing happening of older families who had large ranch lands as you go further west from Austin and San Antonio. Their children and grandchildren don't really want to ranch anymore. So they're chopping that land up and making subdivisions. So that is fragmenting it. And then to build all these places, the amount of quarries being built is tremendous to get all this limestone out of the ground. And that's part of this karst system that technically, before they do these quarries, they need to study to find out if there are cave systems, if there are salamanders, anything like that, or if there are the golden cheek warbler habitat in the area. So again, unfortunately, thanks to the species being endangered, that Endangered Species Act actually makes us look at how we're doing things. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't be caring and we wouldn't have green spaces. We wouldn't think about that. And in the end, it's going to come back to bite us because we need to be thinking about water quality and quantity. You know, where are these 4 million people going to get their water from? And then where is their wastewater going to go? What are we going to do with their wastewater? These are some of the things we need to ask. And I wanted to mention some of the solutions. There are a lot of things we can talk about. That's a whole other, it's gonna be like a course on it. And I have to say, thankfully, there are enough people working on this. We just need to get like kind of above the curve because it's still really hard. Texas is an amazing place, but it doesn't like to be managed and it doesn't like regulations. So we have to see how that can happen. But an interesting link is the thing about people using and taking advantage of nature to enjoy it. And then more and more groups are understanding. And then we still do have those endangered species that require a certain way of doing things. And I wanted to bring up what happened last year in Hays County. There was a bond issue, Proposition A, I think it was called. They called for land protection, creating city parks. I have 3 maps here. There were some of the projects that were included. I think there were up to 10 projects that were presented in that, like a portfolio that the nonprofit organizations brought to the city, to the county council. And basically defined, here's what we need to do, here's how we can fund it. And so it doesn't mean it's all going to happen now, but there's some excellent plans that include a little bit of everything. They include protecting land just to have, for example, land for the golden cheek warbler. It includes making more parks, especially in East Austin, for people to have access to park areas, because we know that the more access you have to park areas, it just creates a better, higher quality of living for communities. It gets the county to think of master plans. We need counties to think of, well, what's happening in the whole county? How are we going to grow? What kind of decisions do we need to make? And kind of really ask those tough questions. It also includes some questions about water treatment. How are you going to make sure that the Blanco River stays clean and beautiful as it is? How are you going to make sure your wells are full? I already mentioned how people will have access to nature. And some areas you want to say total access, and some areas you want to say, well, let's limit it, because we do need to make sure that from, let's say, March to July, the warbler doesn't have anybody bothering it in certain areas, like right near Purgatory Creek. There's some really good golden cheek warbler habitat in San Marcos. And then hopefully all this is going to drive new development models. So we start thinking about how we develop in different ways. Because we don't want, well, people like me and the people at Audubon and all the other groups, they don't want to throw in the towel yet and say, we just don't know how to live on the planet with keeping warblers and people alive. We still think there are ways to do that. And I bring up the Hays County bond issue from last year that passed, thankfully, last November, because now Comal County is looking at it, and some other counties are starting to look at it. And so I think if each county starts looking at that across the way, we will have some solutions come out that we can't even think of right now. And there was 1 or 2 other points that I wanted to bring out, but what my point of this presentation today was, we need to, and from everybody that works with this, we need to start thinking about the Texas Hill Country as like a 3D. We need to imagine the whole thing. When you think of the Hill Country, you can't just think of, okay, let's go drive from the country and look at it and like run to Wimberley for lunch on Sunday, or we're like, what does it mean to each one of us? For the people who take advantage of it, for the people who live there, for the people who live off of it, for their economy, or the people who live on the edge of it, like all the metropolitan areas. How do we all need it? The people of San Antonio had an amazing tax setup. There's like 0.05% or something like this for the water use, actually went into protecting habitat that would ensure the recharge zone. Unfortunately, they stopped that, and they say it's going to be guaranteed somewhere else, but that also guaranteed warbler habitat, for example. So there's really good ways to do this, where you can make sure you have your water sources, make sure you have your, so when you look at this picture here, like for example, that's Balcones Canyonlands in the bottom left. When you look at it, when I look at that, I don't see just pretty green things in the Colorado River. I see habitat for so many animals. I also see a cave system. I see recharge into the aquifer. I see water wells for the city of Austin. I see a lot of things in that one picture. So that's how I think we need to start looking at and defining and think of the region as iconic whole. And I put that little picture of the warbler again because he's looking at us sort of like, what the heck's going on and what are y'all going to do? Because I need to, every year that warbler flies back to Texas, it is hoping and expecting to find a place to breed, because its nature tells it there's going to be a place. It's always been there since warblers have existed. Golden cheek warblers existed. They've always bred in Central Texas. So we need to see, are we going to be able to keep a place for the warblers to keep breeding and also keep a place for us to keep growing and enjoying Central Texas. So I think I'll leave it right there and maybe open it up to questions or comments. Thank you very much. I don't know if I should stop sharing.
Paul, let me
Yeah.
see if I can turn on a spotlight for me too. Maybe not. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Looks like Nicole did it. All right, so the first question that we have is from Kathleen. So she has a question about the golden-cheeked warbler and potential delisting. Success in protecting habitat for an endangered species sure sounds like a catch-22. Do a good job and the species could end up delisted by the Fish and Wildlife Service, but delisting then allows governments to reclaim for development the protected land that they depend on. She just wants to know if she understands that correctly, or you can add to that.
Yes, it is kind of a catch-22. Uh-oh, hang on, am I still here? Yeah. That's something we go through because technically, no, there's when a species is listed as endangered, then also a recovery plan is identified for it. And in that recovery plan, it lists a set of conditions that should be fulfilled in order for the species to be taken off the endangered species list. It's kind of tricky because, yeah, it's not a legal requirement that each and every one of those conditions has to be filled. It's like a guideline, but at the same time, they are very strict. So in order to take the species off the list, part of it is to guarantee the future survival of the species. So it's not that there's enough population, we think we're okay, now we can take it off the list and then deforest everything. No, we can't do that. That's what we tend to think, but no, there are certain criteria that have to be met. And one of those is the long-term sustainability of the species itself. We have to guarantee that, even though it's off the endangered species list. But we have to be vigilant because the way things happen, each developer, for example, has to get a permit and they're supposed to determine if it's warbler habitat or not and things like that, and determine what kind of take it's called, if you're going to harass or kill any kind of warbler. But the Fish and Wildlife generally doesn't, although it's considered in the law, it generally doesn't look at the cumulative effect. Let's say you have 20 developers going into one area. They don't look at it all together. And this is a problem all over the United States. The cumulative, I can't even say it, maybe that's why it's a problem. The cumulative effect of habitat destruction on a species, to me, should be a priority. Because if you have each one getting its permit individually, you need to count how much take is called, how much permission are you giving to kill warbler habitat or warblers per permission. And it's the same like with the ocelot in South Texas. How each liquefied natural gas plant was given a permit, but they weren't looked at all together. And if you add up how they're all together, it doesn't even fit the overall population. You feel like 1/3 of the population of ocelots. So yeah, there's a lot of, that's why you still need these nonprofit organizations to be fighting this. You still need the scientists to be looking at it because there's just a lot of pressure. And what I forgot to mention is, I don't know, I missed a slide in there or something, but to me, this is why we really need to rethink how we develop this 1970s concept of just shaving everything and putting up new houses. And it's all going on. Now it's all over more and more south between, like New Braunfels is one of the fastest growing areas in the region. Then you have Austin, not per se as the county, as Travis County, but Williamson County is growing like crazy, which is right north of Austin. And it's the same thing, just shave everything down, shave the hills, build the houses all in a row, and then plant these different oak trees, little bitty ones. We just have to get rid of that concept of shaving it all down and restarting. We have to think of new ways of how people can live here.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's something that I've noticed as well, just with the process of me moving and looking at more of the suburban areas of Austin, that they really just, flatten everything out. And it's like, why? It seems like they could be more strategic about the way that they're developing things.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the growth, because the hill country is so beautiful, people say, oh, I want to live in the hill country, so let's develop over there. But then the actual thing that you think is so beautiful is being destroyed. So if you look at like from Austin to Dripping Springs, it's all rooftops now. When you get on top of a hill and you just look, there's no more vegetation, it's just all rooftops. And unfortunately, the growth really generated more into the western counties, then east into like towards Bastrop, which is happening now, like towards Bastrop, Lockhart, all as you go south, there's a whole different dynamic. That's more farmland. That never was warbler habitat, for example. As soon as you get past the hill country, the warblers don't go over there. There's other species like the Houston toad, but we won't get into that right now.
Absolutely. And it looks like that's it for questions. There were a few small ones in the chat box, but it looks like they've just been answered by other folks. Someone mentioned during the last question that the Balcones Canyonlands Preserve is protected in perpetuity. So that, assists in making sure that the land is not cut down after the golden-cheeked warbler were to become delisted. But yeah, it looks like that's it for questions. So we appreciate your time, Paul.
Well, thank you very much. I hope people enjoyed the presentation and got something out of it. I didn't want to talk specifically birds because you have mostly birders on who know a lot more than I do about specific bird species. So I didn't want to get into that territory.
Yeah, I was especially interested by, I didn't actually realize how many salamanders that we had in the hill country. I thought it was just a couple species. So that was
yeah, and every couple of years they're finding new ones that are actually not subspecies, they're their own species.
That's crazy. And the fact that they really don't have any overlap in habitat. And so they're able to, that speciation is really strong, very different lineages.
Yeah. And our future is tied together, we live, they live, they live, we live. So that's what I like about presenting it this way,
Yeah, that's right. Well, thank you again so much, Paul. And if anybody thinks of a question, you can just send it to me and I can forward it to him. But otherwise, we'll see you all at the next lunch series talk. You all have a great day. Thanks again, Paul.
Bye-bye. Thank you.